Tucker Carlson thought he could control the conversation, until Jasmine Crockett brought the receipts. Live. On. Air. What started as a typical debate turned into one of the most brutal reality checks we've ever seen on national TV, and Tucker was not ready for it. Stay locked in, because this showdown will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about who's really telling the truth on television. Live on national television, everything changed. The tension was already thick, the audience expecting another routine political sparring match, but no one saw what was coming. Jasmine Crockett, unapologetically bold, sharp as ever, and clearly ready for a fight, wasn't there to play defense. She sat coolly across from Tucker Carlson, one of the most polarizing and controversial figures in American media, known for dominating interviews and controlling narratives with smug confidence and rhetorical traps. From the very beginning, you could feel something was different. This wasn't going to be a typical debate. This wasn't going to be a back and forth with Tucker talking over his guest and controlling the flow. Jasmine was locked in, laser-focused. Then, mid-sentence, while Tucker was launching into one of his signature monologues filled with condescension and barely veiled cultural jabs, Jasmine calmly reached into her folder, looked him dead in the eyes, and dropped the bombshell that would rock the room. Since you want to talk about honesty, Tucker, let's be honest about these texts you sent. The studio fell into a surreal silence. For a moment, Tucker looked genuinely stunned. His face froze. He blinked rapidly. That confidence, the smirk, the smarminess, the interrupting tone he was so famous for, it all disappeared in an instant. You could see the panic flash behind his eyes. It wasn't just a dramatic TV moment, it was a shift in power. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just calling him out, she was holding the receipts. What she held in her hands weren't rumors, weren't vague accusations. They were printed screenshots of text messages allegedly sent by Tucker himself, messages dripping with racially charged language, derogatory descriptions, and unfiltered bias. She didn't just wave them around either. She read them. Slowly. Clearly. Word for word. In front of the nation. And with each sentence, the image of Tucker Carlson that his viewers had trusted and believed in for years, the man who claimed to be a truth-teller, a fearless journalist, an advocate for real Americans, began to crack and collapse. One line she read stood out above all: "It's not how white men fight. We don't use mob violence. That's not our culture." The weight of that line, spoken by someone with such a large media platform, was devastating. Crockett paused, let the silence linger, then asked him directly, "Explain that, Tucker. Explain to America what you meant by that." It was bold. It was fearless. And Tucker? He flailed. He tried to interrupt, claiming the messages were being taken out of context, but he never offered a real explanation. He shifted in his seat, his voice growing louder and more erratic. You could hear the frustration rising. This wasn't a man in control. This was someone desperately trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. He accused her of ambushing him, even though she was simply reading his own words. It was the first time many had seen Tucker visibly rattled, no longer the composed figure behind the desk but a man facing a mirror he didn't want to look into. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't even get angry. She stayed calm, methodical, a complete contrast to the unraveling happening across from her. She pointed out that the problem wasn't just the words, it was the pattern, the mindset, the willingness to fan the flames of division for ratings and political influence. She reminded viewers that this wasn't a one-off. These messages weren't shocking because they were out of character, they were shocking because they confirmed what many had suspected for years. The confrontation didn't just embarrass Tucker Carlson, it exposed the very machinery of how certain media voices manipulate narratives, stoke fear, and then play the victim when challenged. By the time the segment ended, the damage was done. The internet erupted. Hashtags like #TuckerTexts and #Crockett exposes Carlson began trending within minutes. Millions were already watching the clip on loop. Political commentators called it one of the most powerful moments of televised accountability they'd ever seen. Even some conservatives couldn't deny how badly Tucker fumbled. It wasn't just a bad look, it was a full-blown reckoning. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a debate. She made a statement. She showed that courage, preparation, and truth-telling still have power, even in a media landscape built on spin and spectacle. She reminded viewers that standing up to racism, no matter how polished or disguised it may appear, is still necessary. And she did it in a way that was intelligent, strategic, and unforgettable. What happened live on air that night wasn't just a viral moment. It was a shift, a reset. A call to action for those tired of performative politics and coded language. It was a moment where someone finally said, "No more hiding. No more pretending. Let's talk about what's really going on." And she said it right to Tucker Carlson's face. From the very first minute of the show, Tucker Carlson made it clear what his strategy was. He leaned into his typical playbook, rapid-fire questions, smug commentary, and sharp interruptions designed to throw his guest off balance. He'd done this hundreds of times before with senators, professors, activists, and even celebrities. This time, he was going after Jasmine Crockett. And like always, he underestimated her. The segment opened with Tucker trying to frame the conversation around identity politics, a phrase he frequently uses to dismiss issues related to race, gender, and inequality. He accused Crockett of playing the race card and claimed that Democrats like her were obsessed with victimhood. In his words, real Americans didn't care about color or division, they cared about policy, and Crockett, in his view, was only fueling cultural anger for political gain. But Jasmine wasn't rattled. In fact, she looked amused. With a calm, steady voice, she responded, "Tucker, I didn't bring race into this, you did. And if we're going to talk about it, let's talk about it truthfully." Right then and there, viewers could sense that something unusual was happening. This wasn't going to be a typical Carlson-controlled conversation. Crockett wasn't dodging his jabs, she was countering them, sharply, and with receipts. Tucker pressed harder. He brought up crime statistics, blamed woke politics for the breakdown of American values, and even suggested that black leaders like Crockett were hurting their own communities. His tone grew more aggressive as he tried to paint her as part of what he called the radical left agenda. Each accusation was designed to provoke her, to make her lose her composure, because that's what made for viral clips. But Jasmine wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead of reacting emotionally, she dissected every claim he made. Point by point. She challenged his so-called facts, highlighting how many of them came from cherry-picked sources or were rooted in long-debunked narratives. She pushed back with her own data, her own stories, and her own lived experience, reminding viewers that this wasn't just politics, this was about real people's lives. And this is where the dynamic began to shift. Carlson, who was used to dominating his segments, began interrupting more. He started speaking over her, clearly uncomfortable with her steady tone and refusal to play by his rules. But Crockett wouldn't back down. She leaned in, raised her eyebrows, and said, "Tucker, are you afraid to let me speak?" That question stopped him in his tracks, just for a moment. The crowd, live or watching at home, felt it. This was no longer his show. She had flipped the table. Tucker tried to regain control by switching topics quickly, another tactic he often uses when he feels cornered. He brought up immigration, then turned to the protests in 2020, trying to blame Democratic leaders for riots in the streets. Again, Crockett responded with poise, clarifying the difference between peaceful protest and chaos, and even pointing out Carlson's double standards when covering white-led protests versus black-led ones. At this point, his frustration was starting to show. He leaned forward, raised his voice, and asked, "Why is it that whenever someone disagrees with you, they're automatically a racist?" And that's when Jasmine made her move. She paused, took a breath, and said, "You know what, Tucker? Let's stop talking about generalities. Let's talk about you." This was the moment everything started to shift in her favor. The trap she had been patiently setting from the start was finally closing. She had spent the first half of the interview letting him talk, letting him dig deeper and deeper into his usual talking points, and now she was about to flip the spotlight directly onto him. Tucker didn't realize it yet, but he was walking straight into one of the most humiliating moments of his career. You could feel the anticipation building. The audience watching from home could see it in her face. Jasmine Crockett was done playing along. She had something. Something big. And Tucker had no idea it was coming. Still, he pressed on, unaware of what was about to happen. He tried one last time to pivot, saying, "Let's not make this personal." But Jasmine just smiled. "Oh, but Tucker, you already did," she said. "You made it personal the moment you sent those messages." His face changed instantly. For the first time in the segment, Tucker Carlson looked genuinely uncertain. That cool, controlled persona was slipping, and viewers could see it. The tension in the studio was now undeniable. Everyone knew something big was about to drop. The smug host who'd made a career out of putting others on the defensive was about to face a reckoning of his own, and Jasmine Crockett was holding the evidence. This wasn't just political theater. It was something far more powerful. It was a rare moment of public accountability, and Jasmine had just taken full control of the narrative. And then came the moment that would change everything. As Tucker Carlson launched into another one of his long, finger-pointing monologues, criticizing what he called leftist hypocrisy and reverse racism, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward with quiet purpose. She reached into her folder, calmly pulled out a stack of papers, and placed them on the table in front of her. With the nation watching, she said the words that made time stand still. "These are your words, Tucker. Let's talk about these." Carlson stopped mid-sentence. His brow furrowed. His trademark smirk faltered. His eyes dropped briefly to the papers in her hand, and for the first time in years, he looked uncertain. What followed was not an argument or a debate. It was a public reckoning. Crockett lifted the paper and began to read aloud. The texts, reportedly leaked from a former producer during Tucker's final months at Fox News, were real. And brutal. Sent through private channels, they revealed a raw, unfiltered version of Carlson that even many of his supporters had never seen before, a version filled with coded racism, historical resentment, and overt racial superiority. The first text was shocking on its own. "It's not how white men fight. We don't use mob violence. That's not our culture." The words echoed through the studio like a siren. Crockett paused afterward, letting the line breathe, letting it land. The silence that followed was deafening. The implication was impossible to ignore. Carlson wasn't just talking about political opponents. He was defining whiteness as noble, disciplined, and orderly, while implying that other racial groups were inherently violent, chaotic, and dangerous. Crockett didn't yell. She didn't need to. She let the text speak for itself. "You want to talk about truth, Tucker," she said slowly. "Let's talk about what this text says about you." Tucker's response was immediate and panicked. He stammered, "That quote is taken out of context," while shifting in his chair, clearly trying to gain back footing. He reached for his notes, tried to cut in, even motioned to the producers off camera. But Crockett didn't stop. She read the next text. "Sometimes I wonder how much longer this country can take pretending these people share our values." Another pause. Another blow. This time, Tucker visibly recoiled. His voice cracked as he attempted to interrupt, saying, "This is a smear. This is absurd." But the audience could see the truth. He wasn't in control anymore. Crockett continued, reading from the same page. "They hate everything about America, and yet they want to rule it." She stopped again, this time locking eyes with Carlson. "You claim to be a patriot. You claim to speak for the people. But these aren't the words of someone who loves this country. These are the words of someone who fears losing power, and blames everyone who doesn't look like him." Tucker looked stunned, and this wasn't just for show. There was no witty comeback, no sarcastic deflection. He was caught, not just in a political contradiction but in a personal one. For years, Carlson had positioned himself as the voice of truth, fighting the so-called liberal agenda. But here he was, exposed by his own words, words that reeked of racial resentment and fear-based nationalism. The studio audience, often quiet during political interviews, audibly gasped. Viewers online were already clipping the moment and uploading it to TikTok, YouTube, and Twitter. In real time, the entire internet began to react. People weren't just shocked. They were outraged. And they were sharing Jasmine's performance everywhere. Tucker, scrambling, tried one more time to spin it. You don't know the full context. These were part of a longer conversation. But Crockett didn't budge. The context doesn't erase the content, she replied. And the content is crystal clear. She went further, explaining how this kind of coded language wasn't new. It had been used for generations to dehumanize, to divide, and to justify everything from police brutality to voter suppression. And now, she added, it was being broadcast to millions every night under the banner of news. She leaned forward again, still calm, and dropped one final truth bomb. This isn't about Democrat versus Republican. This is about accountability. And you, Tucker Carlson, are finally being held to account. Carlson looked like a man who had just been hit by a truck. His cheeks were red, his voice was rising, and his attempts to steer the conversation back had completely collapsed. He waved his hand, asked for a commercial break, even accused Jasmine of pulling a stunt. But it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. The moment had already gone viral. By the end of the segment, the internet had fully erupted. Memes were flooding social feeds. Hashtags like hashtag Tucker exposed, hashtag Crockett claps back, and hashtag texts Stantili were trending on Twitter and Instagram. Every political podcast was lining up clips of the moment. Even some of Carlson's most loyal viewers were asking, did he really say that? What Jasmine Crockett did wasn't just read some leaked messages. She shattered the polished illusion that Tucker Carlson had carefully crafted over years. She forced him to face the version of himself he never thought would be seen, and she did it on live TV, with facts, clarity, and unapologetic precision. It wasn't a debate. It was an exposure. By this point, the tone in the studio had shifted entirely. What started as just another Tucker Carlson segment had turned into a full-on implosion, and everyone could see it happening in real time. After Jasmine Crockett finished reading the now-viral texts aloud, Tucker didn't just look uncomfortable, he looked cornered. His body language was defensive. He leaned back in his chair, then forward again. He shifted in his seat, his voice strained, trying desperately to regain control of the conversation that had spiraled completely out of his hands. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. Not by a long shot. As Tucker fumbled to respond, tossing out claims of misrepresentation and context manipulation, Jasmine leaned in with a calm, composed demeanor that only amplified Tucker's unraveling. You keep saying context, she said, looking him straight in the eye. But you don't deny these words are yours. That's what America sees, not some fake context. They see your character. Tucker raised his voice, clearly flustered. He started talking over her, a tactic he normally used to dominate debates, but it backfired. Every time he interrupted, it only made him look more desperate. His voice grew louder, more erratic. The calm, smug host viewers were used to had been replaced by someone rattled, angry, and scrambling. And Jasmine? She just sat back, letting him dig his own hole deeper. At one point, Tucker slammed his hand on the desk and said, "This is a smear campaign. You're attacking me instead of talking about the real issues." But Crockett was ready. She didn't flinch. She coolly replied, "Your words are the issue, Tucker. Your pattern of dehumanizing language isn't just offensive, it's dangerous. You've created a platform that normalizes hate, and now you're mad because someone held a mirror to it?" Tucker looked genuinely stunned. This wasn't how his interviews were supposed to go. Usually, he was the one dictating the tone, choosing when to pivot, when to mock, when to dominate. But now he was in reactive mode, flailing, trying to recover, and failing, badly. Producers in the background were visibly tense. Carlson glanced off camera multiple times, possibly signaling for help or a cut to commercial. But Crockett kept going. "You've made a career out of pointing fingers, demonizing communities you don't understand, and calling it news, she said. Tonight, those same people finally get to see what happens when you get questioned. Social media was now exploding. People were live streaming the segment, clipping his stuttering responses, and posting side-by-side comparisons of his usual cocky persona versus the red-faced, sweat-glazed figure now melting on camera. Memes started popping up instantly. One viral post read, "Tucker, I ask the tough questions. Also Tucker, can't handle one answer." Carlson tried changing the subject multiple times. He brought up inflation. He brought up border security. He even mentioned Hunter Biden, but it didn't work. Every time he tried to pivot, Crockett dragged him right back to the texts. "You can deflect all you want," she said, calmly flipping through more papers. "But every time you raise your voice, America hears it loud and clear. This is what guilt sounds like." Then came the most dramatic moment of the segment. Tucker pointed directly at her and said, "You don't belong on this show if you're going to act like this. You're turning this into a circus." And Jasmine, without skipping a beat, replied, "Then maybe it's time someone turned the lights on under the big top." Boom. Just like that, she flipped his insult right back on him, and the crowd, both in studio and online, erupted. The line went instantly viral. People were quoting it, posting it with flame emojis, and stitching it into TikToks within minutes. Carlson, visibly shaken, seemed lost for a moment. He shuffled his papers, sipped from his coffee mug, and muttered something about Democrats always playing dirty. But his usual rhythm was gone. His entire posture, the way he sat, the tone of his voice, even the way he looked into the camera, all screamed one thing: damage control. And Jasmine knew it. She wrapped up her statement by addressing the viewers directly. "You don't have to believe me," she said. "Just read the words. Ask yourself if this is the voice of someone who represents unity, or division. Ask yourself if you want your kids listening to this kind of rhetoric on national television every night." Tucker tried to cut in one last time, but it was too late. The segment had already spun out of his hands, and the internet had already chosen its hero. Crockett had exposed more than just private texts. She had exposed the real Tucker Carlson, unfiltered, uncomfortable, and clearly unprepared to face the consequences of his own rhetoric. By the time they cut to commercial, it was obvious who had won. And it wasn't even close. The moment the segment ended, the ripple effect was instant and unstoppable. Twitter turned into a battleground. Instagram reels were flooded with clips of Jasmine Crockett's calm dismantling of Tucker Carlson. YouTube videos popped up within the hour with titles like "Tucker Gets Owned Live" and "Crockett Drops Receipts on Live TV." News outlets, influencers, commentators, everyone had something to say, and nearly all of it was in Jasmine's favor. The fallout had begun, and it was massive. For Tucker Carlson, this wasn't just a bad segment. It was a career moment, and not the good kind. People weren't focusing on his talking points. They weren't even debating whether the texts were taken out of context. The general public was stuck on one thing: the fact that he didn't deny the words were his. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. All he did was flail, dodge, and melt down, and that told people everything they needed to know. Across social media, even some of his own fans started expressing doubt. Comment threads that once blindly defended him now included phrases like, "This one's hard to defend," "Not his best moment," and "He really fumbled." It wasn't just a partisan reaction, this hit deeper. Because when you brand yourself as the truth teller, as Tucker so often has, and then you crumble when your own truth is exposed, people notice. And they remember. Fox News, known for fiercely protecting its most popular voices, remained silent for hours. No official statement. No response. Just quiet scrambling behind the scenes. Reports later leaked that Carlson's team had begged producers to cut the segment early. Others claimed the network internally debated whether to release a clipped, cleaned-up version of the interview to air in reruns, one that conveniently cut out the most damaging parts. But it was too late. The internet had already made sure the full version was preserved forever. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's name was everywhere. She didn't just win the interview, she elevated herself into national political superstardom. She was trending on every platform. Her follower counts skyrocketed. Her quotes were being shared by activists, celebrities, and political leaders. Late-night hosts mentioned the moment in their monologues. Young voters, a group often overlooked in mainstream politics, were posting TikToks praising her poise, her strategy, and her ability to drag without raising her voice. Even high school and college students were reposting the moment, calling her the future of political discourse. But it wasn't just about going viral. This was about something bigger. Crockett had done what very few could. She took on one of the loudest voices in right-wing media, exposed his hypocrisy, and walked away not only unharmed but empowered. She didn't scream. She didn't rant. She just showed up with facts, calm confidence, and unshakable clarity. And that, more than anything, resonated with people across the political spectrum. Organizations that advocate for media accountability praised her as a model for how to confront toxic narratives with truth. Civil rights groups immediately began highlighting her moment as a turning point in how racial bias in media is challenged publicly. Political analysts said the segment was historic, not just because of the confrontation, but because of how effectively Crockett flipped the traditional media script. Instead of being the one on defense, she forced Carlson to answer for his own behavior, and that doesn't happen often. The media ecosystem was stunned. Conservative outlets scrambled to spin the story, trying to downplay her performance or question the legitimacy of the texts. But the damage was done. And the more they tried to distract, the more people shared the original clip, unedited, undeniable. Behind the scenes, sources suggested that Carlson was furious. Some claimed he berated his staff. Others said he demanded edits to future broadcasts and canceled additional guest appearances for the week. He reportedly blamed producers for not vetting Crockett more thoroughly. But none of that could erase the truth. He got exposed on his own platform, by someone he thought he could outtalk. In the days that followed, Jasmine Crockett leaned into the momentum, but not in a showy way. She gave a few interviews, thanked supporters, and reminded people that this wasn't about ego or winning a debate. It was about accountability. It was about making sure the public sees the people behind the punditry, the real views, the real language, the real consequences. She said, "If I made people uncomfortable, that's okay. Discomfort is how change begins. But let's be clear, I didn't make those texts. I just read them." That line echoed through every corner of social media and was quoted in editorials nationwide. People respected her restraint. They admired her clarity. And they saw in her a type of leadership that's become rare, not just fiery, but intelligent, intentional, and authentic. Tucker Carlson may return to his show. He may continue to push his views. But from this moment forward, every time he speaks about race, every time he critiques identity politics, every time he pretends to be the victim, the public will remember this moment. The night he got exposed. The night he lost control. The night Jasmine Crockett held up a mirror, and he couldn't look into it. And Jasmine? She didn't just walk out of that studio victorious. She walked out as a new voice of fearless truth. A force to be reckoned with. A symbol of what it looks like when the next generation of leaders says, "Enough is enough." One thing's clear after that moment: when facts meet fear, the truth always wins. If you found this as wild as we did, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment like this again. This is State Talk, where we break down the real stories, no spin, just truth. Catch you in the next one.